by acknowledging that this event is taking place on Anishinaabe territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This is an event about the tar sands movement and the industry that it's against. I'm one of the editors, and I'll be introducing the speakers in the book. Before I get into it, I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Rabel Lattier and Center for Social Justice, and our speakers as well. So, this book, A Line in the Tar Sands, is meant to be part of a living movement, and so we have some emphasis on Line 9 campaigning today on our panel. That's a pipeline that goes through Ontario along the way to Montreal, and more than 6 contributors have been part of the Line 9 campaign. Tar sands resistance increasingly is needed here in Ontario. The industry is expanding through the province with pipelines, refining, and in other ways that I'll talk about. And this is in addition to the ongoing support that it's had for years from the federal parliament and from Bay Street here in Ontario. Now Toronto's drinking water is at risk because of Enbridge pipelines. But the worst impacts are not here. They're in northern Alberta, some of those, where you have strip mining, you have well pads for in situ extraction, which is steams blasted to melt the earth, and then you get groundwater pollution. There's risks of explosions. And in northern Alberta, you have massive tailings ponds, pipelines, and so forth. Various destructive industrialization. And then you have worsened impacts around refineries, like those around Aamjiwnaang, about 3 hours west of Toronto, the community that Lindsay's from. And with the pipeline projects, the threats are worse in native territory, such as that of the Chippewas of the Thames. And these projects worsen climate change, which is already hitting the more oppressed and poor and marginalized peoples of the world the hardest, with tropical storms and various extreme weather in the Caribbean, small island states, and it's already happening. And here, to an extent, we're getting weather fluctuations and whatnot. Crops are being impacted, but we're not on the front lines of climate change. So we're at a historical turning point right now. The tar sands industry could be stopped before it becomes more entrenched, and greenhouse gases could be stopped before we go over climate tipping points that involve, for instance, methane being released from the Arctic as it melts, and then the methane worsens climate change, and then that's just a terrible feedback loop. And we discuss a range of environmental impacts and threats in the introduction to this book. But there's much more to our struggles beyond environmental issues. There's a history of colonization that we're reckoning with. There's decisions about how the economy is to be run, and a lot more. So a bit about me before I continue. I'm one of the editors. I first engaged with tar sands campaigning 5 years ago after doing some other organizing around energy and climate and environmental justice issues. I live in St. Catharines. I've done Line 9 campaigning in 2 other cities I lived in recently, and I was part of a previous campaign against the Royal Bank of Canada's tar sands financing. I'm also an editor for Upping the Ante, a Toronto-based social movement journal, which is really great, and I have copies of the latest issue if anyone's interested. I highly recommend you check it out. And another project I'm part of is Stop Fracking Ontario, which is about a different form of extreme energy that we're facing here in the province. So in short, I'm an activist, I'm an editor, and a writer. And this book includes contributions from 38 contributors, a range of activists, journalists, and scholars. So it's potentially useful for movement strategizing, but also for research and a lot more. And we're trying to combine the strengths of each of these approaches. So that involves trying to have accessibility and relevance, but also reflections and research. And it combines more local and community-based perspectives with bigger picture conceptual pieces. And there's contributions from Canada, the US, the UK. And as editors, we took on supporting roles, especially to try to support social movements. And that includes donating our proceeds to frontline activists. And there was a lot of work that went into this project beginning in late 2011 that involved facilitating, bringing people together, promoting the contributions as we're doing now. And as editors, we're among the 38 contributors, and there's also photos from 7 photographers that are included, and one of those photographers is Toronto-based photographer Alan Listener, whose work is on, one of his photos is on the back cover. And that's actually from a Toronto rally in 2010 against the Royal Bank of Canada's Tarsands financing. So this book, we've tried to capture many important sides of the movement and the critiques of the tar sands to help deepen understandings, to go beyond the kind of talking points that as activists we often don't get a chance to go beyond in our press releases or our event announcements because we're so caught up in the work on those. And we need those activist contributions, but we need more too. And there's unity among the contributors and the editors against tar sands. That's the line that threads it all together. The idea of a line in the tar sands is that the expansion must not go any further. It must stop now. And we take an environmental justice approach to this, which is about bringing social justice and environmentalism together. And we've tried to foreground Indigenous sovereignty and solidarity struggles in defense of land and water and wildlife and community autonomy against a very invasive and destructive industry. The collection also includes anti-capitalist perspective, anti-oppressive responses to racism, patriarchy, and there's migrant justice contributions, pro-democracy perspectives. There's a lot of linkages that we've tried to draw through this project. And there's some diversity in the politics in the collection, but a lot of recurring threads, such as those I mentioned. So all of these struggles are important in themselves, and they also link up in opposition to the tar sands industry. And a perspective that we've tried to foreground in this book is that the front lines of these struggles are especially important. These are the areas that are directly facing the extraction impacts and threats and the pipeline projects and the industry's dirty, deadly business in general. So we have frontline contributions, for instance, from Melina Labucan-Massimo of the Lubucan Cree and Crystal Lehman of the Beaver Lake Cree. And then there's chapters that reflect dialogue with the front lines, such as Sonia Grant's attention to the situation around the Kalamazoo spill in Michigan. And then I wrote a chapter about the Chemical Valley industries that surround Aamjiwnaang here in Ontario. So these frontline perspectives, as a movement, we should be prioritizing voices from the front lines whenever we can and support the mobilizations that happen there. And that's been a feature of the Northern Gateway campaigning, and the Line 9 campaigning, and it's important in the movement against tar sands. The front lines are where the most support is needed, and there's the most potential for motivations to resist the industry. So support that's directed there can go a long way. In theory, it's a lot more complicated in practice, but these are sound priorities for a movement that can be really effective in confronting the industry as a whole. The local struggles can feed into a groundswell of system change. And we have to be really strategic in our movement building, and frontline solidarity is part of that. But there's a lot to be done to overturn this industry. It's massive. And as an aside, very recently there's been some emphasis on a drop in the price of oil, as though that's really going to change the situation. But I looked into this a bit, and FYI, the price is still far higher than it was in the 1990s. It was, on average, less than a third in the 1990s as it is right now. And at its lowest in the 90s, it was only a fifth of what it is now. this is an industry that's really taken off since the 90s, and that situation is still where we're at. I mean, the rising prices that make it profitable haven't gone away. There's just been a dip. And this is an industry that has decades of subsidies and build-up in general behind it. But it's really taken off in the new millennium, and it's still going strong. And in Alberta, the industry wants to mine an area the size of England. That's their plan. But the situation's worse, even just in terms of extraction, okay? Because you have deposits in Utah, where struggles are already well underway. Tar sands extraction has already begun in Venezuela and Madagascar, and there's plans for extraction in Trinidad and Tobago. And there's a chapter about those international plans and the beginning of struggles around those. So this industry is leading us into an age of extreme energy, where tar sands and fracking become central to the economy, to the energy makeup of our society. And this includes, as another aside, plans to frack shale gas here in Ontario, which I've tried to engage with, and there isn't much momentum around that, but it's really important, and I encourage you to look into it, because it's terrible. But we're here to focus on tar sands, and the expansion on that front involves extraction, pipeline threads, worse refining. All of the extreme energy expansion is worse than conventional oil. You get far more pollution, far more waste in terms of spoiled fresh water, increased greenhouse gas releases, more sulfur around refineries, the list goes on. So, again, we're at a turning point in history here, and the key question is whether we're going to stop this shift into extreme energy. Because it's happening, and the people who are alive right now are going to, if anyone's going to stop it, it's us. And Canada has leading roles in the tar sands expansion that's happening worldwide. So the book chapters, there's a lot about resistance in the book, and we point to a range of ways we can oppose this industry. That includes divestment campaigning and lobbying. There's actually a chapter about poetry as a form of resistance. And there's emphasis on defending treaties, because here in Canada, these are constitutionally recognized, and they're actually a foundation for the Canadian state. And so treaties can be legal obstacles to the industry's expansion. And we can challenge the industry supporters, the funders, the press, the government officials. There's a chapter that argues for the importance of that strategy. And a crux of whether we win or not is going to be whether investors flee from this industry. Could get to the point where they view it as a sinking ship and they just want out, and it could go under. Ultimately, people in this movement are part of broader struggles for a better world, and rejecting tar sands is part of that. But we look at various intersections in this collection, including with struggles for green jobs and energy alternatives. Lillian co-wrote a chapter about that, and there's another chapter from Jeremy Brecher about green jobs and unions, which are often resistant to these kinds of alternatives, for the time being, at least. And the change that can be linked with tar sands movement struggles includes indigenous resurgence, a revival of traditional ways of being with community autonomy, self-sufficiency. That doesn't do justice to what I'm referring to, but there's more writing on this from Zakihito Nawasis and Winona LaDuke and others in the collection. But there's some major divisions that we have to overcome. And that includes those that often appear between NGOs and grassroots social justice organizers, as Dave Vasey, a Toronto activist, explores, and from a constructive perspective, considers in this collection. And there's definitely room for improvement in terms of solidarity with Indigenous peoples. I'll suggest a major thread in this book is advocating further Indigenous leadership in the movement. And there's so much more that has to be done for the sake of various causes, including building a united front against this industry. Now, the industry promotes the idea that there's no alternative to its expansion, as another of the chapters discusses, and it also claims to be green and ethical. That kind of marketing rhetoric is critiqued in the book as well. But it's expanding for the sake of profit, which means more extraction, more pipelines, more refining, more shipments by rail and water. And overall, it's winning. It also is shipping these massive megaloads modules, which are up to 3 stories. They look like, to me, as a sort of ignorant person on engineering, they look to me like pieces of rocket ships. And there's struggles around those. It depends on exploiting non-status migrant workers, as one of the chapters in particular focuses on the migrant justice side of all of this. And it's doing all this to try to meet the pace of expansion that's expected by investors. Because fossil fuels are the lifeblood of companies like Shell and BP and Enbridge, and the list goes on. And these are massive corporations that are tied to the political right in Canada. And it's important to recognize how there's massive support from this industry, from the federal and Alberta governments in particular. Also, BC's turning out to be quite significant. So these governments are cutting environmental standards, marketing the industry, etc. There's a chapter in the book about how Canadian officials are going over to Europe and the US to lobby on behalf of the industry. For instance, to try to ease the way for tar sands exports from Canada. And then you have international agreements that protect the investments of these companies. They're transnational investments, though, so the significance of the agreement with China has often been overstated, as another chapter argues. And there's so many sides to the industry's expansion. Lana will speak more about pipelines and the importance of struggles around those. As for refining, I won't say much more about that, but there's a set of locations where tar sands is worsening pollution. There's at least 50 refineries that are already processing tar sands in North America. In Texas, for instance, which received some attention in a chapter in this book, tar sands is already flowing there because the southern leg of Keystone XL has already been completed. And there's a chapter that profiles struggles on that end of the pipeline around refining and shipments and more. But refining is currently concentrated around the Great Lakes, and that includes the Sarnia-Lambton refineries that are surrounding Aamjiwnaang. And the situation there is not my story, but I'll just add this fact. In early 2014, approximately 100,000 barrels of tar sands were processed in Sarnia-Lambton per day, just a few hours west of here, worsening the pollution. And I couldn't tell you whether the Nanticoke facility, which is about an hour and a half drive from here southwest, is processing tar sands, but if it's not already, you can assume it will be. And just as I wrap up my intro here, in terms of what's most relevant to us here in Ontario, the manufacturing of modules, those megaloads modules, that's part of the plan for how Ontario can support the tar sands industry. And there's agreements that have already been made with Sarnia-Lambton, but it's a given that the companies want other manufacturers in the province to be, we'll take questions at the end.
I just wanted to ask you what the megaloads modules are.
Those are the massive components that, to me, look like rocket ship parts that are shipped off to the tar sands to be used to build facilities out there. thanks, that was, I should have clarified that better. So, Ontario is set to at least produce those in Sarnia-Lambton and possibly elsewhere. And then there's the pipelines through here, including Line 9, also Energy East. Tar sands pipelines are more likely to spill. So the industry's here. It's bringing its impacts and threats here, which are only escalating as it expands. And I'll leave it at that.